Friends and patriots, welcome back. This is Lippincott Talk, and I am your host, Josiah Lippincott. Today we are talking about events in the news, and therefore we're going to be talking about the Iran war. I thought I would provide some background information that I've been digging up over the last couple of days with the hope of clarifying and just the issues at hand and bringing to the fore some things that have been left out by others. In the last episode, I discussed why I'm opposed to the war. And of course, this is obviously controversial because I voted for Donald Trump, I support him, but I'm also at odds with what has now turned into a key aspect of his foreign policy regarding Middle Eastern war. So it might be helpful to recap some of those arguments here. The first and most powerful argument, I think, is that I do not believe the United States has core national security interests in the Middle East. And I don't think that Iran is an existential threat to the United States. In fact, I don't really think they're much of a threat at all. And that includes if they were to one day possess nuclear weapons. Lots of countries have nuclear weapons. They haven't been deployed. They haven't been used in war. A lot of that you can account for that with the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. So right there off the bat, we have nuclear powers like North Korea, Israel, Pakistan, India, China, the former Soviet Union. And what you see is, Russia and the Soviet Union. In none of these cases have these weapons proven to be able to be used as a tool of going on offense geopolitically. What it means, nuclear weapons are primarily a defensive weapon because they force a lot of decisions to be made by your opponents. Like, how can you have a conventional war that's decisive if both parties have nuclear weapons? It's unthinkable. How do you do that? There really isn't a doctrinal way to solve that problem. So what you get is nuclear powers just don't fight direct wars with one another. So from that perspective, I don't think that Iran possessing a nuclear weapon, assuming they are even interested in doing so, which is controversial in its own right, it's questionable at least. Okay, so now Israel and Iran would have an outright standoff in the Middle East and the United States as well. We'd have to have the kind of diplomacy that we've used with North Korea. I think Trump very successfully meeting with Kim Jong-un, that was a huge win for him and shows the power of diplomacy between nuclear armed powers. Nuclear weapons equal respect and they equal national defense. So that's their primary utility in the modern geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in. The other reason that I've opposed the war goes deeper to the nature of the American regime. I do not think it is in our interest to rule over foreigners without their consent. I do not believe that global management benefits the United States at all. I think we suffer from it. The taxes required to fund our planetary military as we go about dictating to virtually every single country on earth how their government should operate, what their values should be. This has not, the return on investment isn't there. And that argument right there is probably the most controversial thing I hold among the mainstream in American foreign policy thought. There's a view that the United States uses military power to secure the petrodollar, so the real value of the dollar is backed by oil and complex, Middle Eastern relations, and that's the real value of our money comes from oil, our ability to control oil around the world. It's just not true, right? The war is not a productive activity. It does not make you wealthier when it's over. So from that perspective, you should fight wars only when you're in a moment of need. And you need to defend yourself from an explicit threat that's confronting you, right? So I'm not anti-war. I'm not a pacifist. I served in the military, and I would serve again if I thought that military service would help secure my country from foreign threats. But the reality today is we have this huge military-industrial complex. It's worth lots of trillions of dollars. We do $1 trillion a year budget that is required to manage the world's affairs. We don't benefit from that. The drawdown on our wealth, the $1 trillion in taxes we collect every year, does not produce $1 trillion worth of security. It doesn't make us safe. You could have the equal or greater levels of safety with less foreign involvement and less spending. And the reason you don't see that is because taxation does not require consent, right? I don't consent to whether or not I'm paying into the military industrial complex that we have. So whether or not it produces results has no bearing on whether or not we as Americans get to utilize the service that we're being provided with here. So when the factions, and I think like in the Iran war, very clearly the Israeli government and certain organizations within the United States, the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, which still exists and is quite powerful, Zionist war hawks, Israeli government agents, others who are interested in their own geopolitical interests, and some of them would be like the Gulf states, also deeply involved in all of our Middle Eastern adventures. You also have factions within the American government which are interested in their own portfolios, and they think they can leverage Middle Eastern conflict and these other factions for their own ends. So what you've ended up happening is the system we have now is not accountable to the American people. We don't fight wars because Americans want them, right? And you can see that clearly because politicians don't run on going to war. This is one of the things that I've been mulling over and processing over the last week and a half or so. Trump did not run on war with Iran. He was always antagonistic toward Iran, always had arguments that alluding to potential military action, but Trump never made the claim on the campaign trail that a core aspect of his presidency was taking out the regime in Iran. Not as a central focus. You have to go to these like side statements to get the sense of okay, Trump is antagonistic toward the Iranian regime. But the idea that he was running on a regime change war or that this was a central part of his victory in 2024, none of that is true. And again, this isn't to condemn Trump specifically. I think this is just a part of the political life that we have now, is that there's just a complete disconnect between the voters and these policy outcomes when it comes to foreign policy. There are wars being waged that do not connect to any sort of statement or comprehensive platform by members of the leading parties in the United States. Like Joe Biden did not run on getting involved in the war with Russia by supporting Ukraine, right? That was just not that wasn't on the table as something that voters were even interested in. 2020 wasn't about that. So again, I think this just goes to show, in my view, there's this profound disconnect between the American people and the actions of their government. And, I understand the reasons that Trump has given for why he is concerned with Iran. And I believe they're sincere reasons, actually. And I don't think it's just Israel made him do it. I think it's a very foolish line of argument. I think Trump got involved in Iran this time around for the reasons he stated. He thinks that Iran possessing a nuclear weapon is a threat to the United States. He believes these arguments that Iran has been waging war on the United States for the last 47 years, that this is a forever war that he's ending. He's a peace president. And, obviously there will be disagreement about those claims. And I disagree with that analysis. And if the president were sitting right here, I would say as much. And I think, I applaud those who did have the courage and fortitude to tell the president, we should not be involved here. There's all kinds of individuals and factions lobbying the president for military action. And what's lacking in our system, I think, are clear and coherent arguments being made in the opposite direction by those with political acumen. So often what you see among non-interventionists is that they're unable to show the really profound benefits that come from not being involved in military action abroad. And again, I want to go back to the sheer savings that we could have from not being involved in these endless series of Middle Eastern wars. I mean, it would just be a phenomenal increase in the quality of life for the American people. Because again, our wars aren't making us more secure. They're not actually leading to security or an improvement of trade. They're actually a burden on trade. The taxes that are required to fund the war machine reduce economic growth. And so when we say, well, we're opening up these sea lanes, it's not even clear that the American government is needed in a lot of these cases to do those roles. It can be, there's an argument, a powerful argument from the time of the founding that the United States government has a role in preserving the freedom of the seas, protecting American citizens abroad. Obviously, there's friction points there with other nations and how that should look and work. But I think the core point that's missing now almost completely is the idea that there should be a direct connection between the good of the American people and the foreign policy that we have abroad. Anyway, that's the overarching theme of my argument. We have disconnected the good of the American people from our foreign policy. Our foreign policy is deeply expensive. Involvement in the Middle East distracts from domestic priorities. This war, I think, at best will be neutral for the president. At worst, it could lead to economic problems that then hurt his ability to enact his domestic agenda and allow the left to come back into power. And I really don't want to see that. So the reason I'm saying the things I am is because I want to see the president succeed. This is not out of spite or even a sense of betrayal. I again, as I've said, I don't think this was a war that Trump ran on, but it's a war that we have now, and the president has his reasons. Okay, this is simply the political situation we find ourselves in. So then what is it that I can do? Well, it's this right here. It's making arguments and putting this in the public square in a way that we can debate and discourse and think about this in a serious way. So that's the goal, is to bring these arguments to the fore and make them as well as I can. I brought this up in the first episode. I like the idea of using questions in a row to try and frame, I think it's a way of framing thought and helping in this format specifically to get the arguments out there as effectively as possible. So I'm going to answer a few questions that I've set for myself and kind of explain my own arguments here. But first, I'm going to take a drink of water. That's Berkey water, by the way, filtered. I'm a Maha patriot. We no pesticides in the water here. It's powerful. No fluoride. I keep the IQ maxed. Very powerful. All right, the first question I framed for myself: when will the war end? Trick question, and I'm not going to provide an answer to it because one of the most important things that I've learned in my adult life, in serving in the military and then thinking about war, is that, and studying it seriously as a scholar and as a student, the fog of war is a real phenomenon. It just, even in peacetime in large organizations like the military, we often lacked crucial information regarding what we were doing, and we were not in an existential situation. And what we see right now is there's a lot of factors that play into the war itself. I think it is presumptuous to, unless you have really sharp analysis and inside information or some new take, the idea that you're going to have, that this is predictable is, I think, one should be very wary of those kinds of strident claims, whether the war will go well or badly. For my part, even if the war goes well and we win, i.e. the Iranian government, signs some kind of accord with the United States, they're now friendly to us, let's say. I think even in that case, the long-term ramifications of the war, the increase in the global empire, are, the continuation of the belief that the United States should manage the world, the cost to our domestic politics, the corruption, the anger that it will generate in the people that we are now ruling over from abroad. All of those long-term trajectories are bad for us. They're just bad. The cost that we spend is not worth it because the core purpose of war is defense. This war isn't meeting that task. There were easier, cheaper ways of defending ourselves, namely just ignoring that whole just ignoring that region, except for ensuring that trade can keep going. But by the way, trade with Iran isn't happening because of sanctions the American government put in place. Okay, so if the argument is trade, why are we suppressing trade? That doesn't make sense. China's buying cheap oil. Why is the oil cheap from Iran? Well, Western powers can't buy it because of American sanctions. You know what I mean? Like, there's an easy solution here. Who cares? Well, money will be used to fund terror. Okay. Why is the security of those regional powers a concern for us? And B, aren't a lot of these other regional powers surrounding Iran also states that have engaged in very dubious and violent practices, to say the least, over the last 40 plus years or more? Again, I just think once you're in the moral framework of America needs to manage the world, then you'll buy into a lot of these other crazy ideas. But the core point here that I want to make again is, just to go back to the question, when will the war end? I don't know. And I don't feel comfortable saying. From my own perspective, I feel skeptical that there will be, well, I go back and forth. I think there are definitely bearish indications here. Particularly around the Strait of Hormuz, I'll present some of the things that I've learned and thoughts that I've had on this subject. But it's a problem. The fog of war is very powerful, and so it's very difficult then to make predictions and to speculate about what will happen in a conflict like this. And I think there's just a need for equanimity. Oil prices this weekend spiked. On Monday, they collapsed. They could spike again. There's a lot of misunderstanding that goes on everywhere because of just the nature of conflict itself. So this is a warning to those who are taking early victory laps. Trump has won. This is so easy. And, doomers who think that we're about to see a catastrophic, loss for the American government or a collapse of the global economy. From my perspective, a lot of this, especially the doomer pessimism, is around the Strait of Hormuz and oil shipments. So the Strait, about 20% of the world's oil and natural gas supply flows through the Strait of Hormuz. And this oil is predominantly used in Asia. Therefore, when you saw over the weekend the spike in prices and the price of oil, it happened in Asian markets who are seeing a decrease in the amount of supply flowing out of the straits and therefore are basically having to come to grip with the possibility that they could have just a massive decrease in the amount of supply available. And that would create, inflationary pressure in the sense that the price of all other goods is going to rise as transportation costs go up. And, you're really going to have consumers reallocating their currencies toward other assets because you can't buy oil. It's not available on the market. So you'll see contraction in a lot of those sectors if that happens. So, what are the possibilities? And I've seen sort of doomsday scenarios if the straits get closed. We could see $6 or $7 a gallon gasoline in the United States as we begin exporting a lot of oil abroad to other countries. If they see their own supplies fall off, what would happen? Well, there is some precedent here. So I looked into this, and between 1980 and 1988, Iraq and Iran fought a war that Iraq initiated. It was a war of aggression launched by Saddam Hussein against Iran, and in that war, the Iraqis, using a mixture of Western purchased weapons and their own, the French, oddly enough, sold them quite a few missiles and technology to sink ships inside of the Arabian Gulf. During that time, the Iraqis attacked Iran and then they attacked the tankers inside the Gulf. And by doing that, it created real problems for the international market. And the United States did get involved and eventually ended up sending a bunch of vessels there to try and help keep trade flowing through the Strait of Hormuz and keep up global energy demand. Now, that was almost 40 years ago that was really, it's 40 years since that's happened, and obviously the global market has changed. The geopolitical situation has changed. For instance, the Soviets were also involved in small part in trying to, be involved in the crisis between Iraq and Iran and the sinking of these tankers. Anyway, I think the key thing here is the number of tankers damaged was in the several hundred got hit, and about 55 were total losses. So just because Iran has, quote unquote, closed the Strait of Hormuz doesn't mean that you can't have oil flow go through the straits. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that even if they are managed to damage and destroy tankers on their way through the straits, it doesn't mean that there won't be ship captains willing to make that run. And the price, for the right price, these corporations and captains are willing to risk themselves in order to make a lot of money. But those risk premiums go up. And again, this isn't something that governments can manage with policy. That's just the market at work. You just have individuals who are involved in the shipping industry who make determinations for themselves about how valuable their lives are and what risk tolerance they're willing to take. And so I do think, there will be, and I think there already are, ship captains willing to run the straits, and that means you're going to see supply make its way out of the Straits of Hormuz, make it onto the global market. So even if Iran is able to close the straits for an extended period of time, it isn't obvious that the result would be economic collapse. A constraint on supply would definitely mean a headwind against economic growth and could mean recession. It could be, in a worst case scenario, a depression. Really serious losses across the markets, across the global marketplace. But there are, transportation costs from, what I'm just seeing is that's a relatively small amount of the overarching cost that's embodied in refining oil, etc. So the market will adjust, and you will get a new equilibrium that will develop once corporations have a better idea of the long-term risk tolerance. It's obviously difficult to know that now, and again, I think that's why. And again, I don't. If you're the kind of person who wants to day trade based off of the news, I really want to strongly recommend you not do that unless you're an expert or very willing and able to lose money, because again, it isn't obvious what the long-term effects of what's going to happen. You're speculating, really, and about risk tolerance and complex geopolitical situation. Again, a long-term closure of the strait would almost certainly involve China to a much larger degree than what's happening now. This presumes the United States can't dispatch enough resources to keep the strait open itself, which is itself, we have had that capacity in the past, and we are demonstrating, I think, military success now in the ability to, put warheads on foreheads. So again, I don't know. I mean, I'm loath to come down in a decisive way on this question of whether or not we'll experience global economic panic. There is certainly the possibility of higher prices. And what we can say for certain is there is economic damage being done right now. Prices are higher than they normally would be. There's volatility in the market. The very nature of that uncertainty is going to serve as a headwind against economic growth and will harm Americans. The question is, to what extent? And I don't think anyone, or at least the vast bulk of commentators, don't really have an answer. And I think they should be honest in saying that. Admit when you don't know what you're talking about, or at least there's reasons for ignorance or historical analogies that raise questions. And if anything I could leave you with today is you want to think through these questions in a serious way and don't let yourself be buffeted by fear. Alone, you need to just keep your wits about you and be very wary of the sources that you trust. And again, I think this is where the history is important. That's what I've been doing over the last several days, and since the war began, is just trying to fill out my knowledge of Iran and the situation it finds itself in. So, again, long-term effects of the war economically. Well, it's unclear. I think there's definitely some very real possibilities of strong downsides. That's certainly possible. There's also the possibility the war just ends. Donald Trump on Monday said that he believed the war was very nearly at an end. And he said this during the trading day, and after that happened, the markets went from negative to positive, and the price of oil was just falling, right? So you can see Trump and that shows that markets believe that Trump has a lot of power over when this war will end. And I think that's right. I think Trump is the most important figure here, right? Iran was attacked, right? They were not on the offensive. They are in a defensive position. The Israelis and the Americans are bombing them and initiated those strikes. So from my standpoint, with the amount of destruction done, Trump can effectively declare victory at almost any time. And the question then becomes, would Iran continue to launch missiles even if the Americans indicated a serious willingness to engage in a ceasefire or just outright did so, just stopped bombing and only set up a defensive position? What would be the ramifications of that choice? Would Iran or Iranian leadership want to continue trying to close the straits, bombing tankers, bombing Iran with ballistic missiles? Is the calculus for Tehran that they should inflict as much pain as possible for the long run, or is the calculus leaning toward accepting that survival is itself a victory? If you're the Iranian leadership class, do you see simply surviving the American and Israeli attack as victory. And the Iranians have been able to make strikes against radar installations, American bases. They have inflicted some casualties, not very many, but they have inflicted some. They've managed to hit Israel. They've managed to do some real damage here. Do you take that, considering your strategic position, do you take that as a win or not? And again, I would say one of the memes about Iran is that they're crazy. The Iranians are these irrational, fanatical actors who do crazy stuff and they can't be comprehended. And I think that's a very stupid and uninformed take. I mean, what I see out of the Iranian leadership class is a lot more conservatism and reticence than one would expect from crazed religious fanatics. The Iranians are not, they're not as, really in a way, you look at the West and you look at someone like Lindsey Graham or Netanyahu, and I feel those types are far crazier and less connected to reality than what I see coming out of the Iranian leadership class and what I've seen historically. Just reviewing the literature on this, the Iranians definitely have they have a taste. They want regional domination. They're willing to kill people. I'm not saying that that's not part of the calculus. What I'm saying is the Iranian strategy seems to be a lot more restrained than the sort of propaganda view gives them credit for. And again, so from that perspective, I do think it's possible for Trump to unilaterally or near unilaterally end the conflict. And I do think the Israelis would go along with it as well. Because, what's the end game here? It's obvious that for Trump, degrading Iranian military capacity and damaging their nuclear program further are the goals. And they've killed the Ayatollah. Okay, you assassinated that guy. There's a lot of things you can just say, okay, we won. We did what we came here to do. You figure it out now. So from that perspective, I think, and if that happened, I think the price changes and economic damage immediately from the war would recover within a couple of months. That's at least what markets are indicating now. Again, not an expert on how that could go out. And I think when you're trying to speculate as to the future and geopolitical events, that's not easy to do. And that leads to a kind of, why do markets behave the way they do? And this, I hope, will be helpful, but this is how I think about it, and my reading indicates, people are saying the markets are irrational and they're volatile. Well, markets are really good at pricing, looking at the exchange of goods, consumer demand, supply chain management. Those are the kinds of things that stock market traders and firms that specialize in commodities and other types of financial products, they know a lot, obviously, about those industries, and they know a lot about the interconnection of those industries to one another, and that's why they make money. Their success is in gathering information in their domain of expertise and then using that information to make intelligent, speculative choices regarding the production over time. And that's what creates profits. And really, there are four things that can really slow down economic growth and throw a monkey wrench in that system. And that's war, theft, natural disaster, and counterfeiting or inflation. Those are the four big things that are outside of the normal market process. In the market, the normal movement is always to greater. Every entrepreneur and investor wants to make money, and they're looking at expanding into new lines of production. They're always looking to innovate and to get that additional layer of marginal value through knowing something, through using human intelligence to serve human needs and wants. In other words, the markets are driven by the human desire for happiness, right? There's something very Aristotelian about this way of thinking, in a way. I mean, that's complicated in its own right. But the point is, the markets are oriented toward satisfying consumer demand and, building out structures of production that can service and serve, the desires that human beings have, the longing for happiness, for wealth, for satisfaction. On the other side, you've got the political and the realm of pain and death and force, and that is really is perpendicular to the market and its emphasis on peace and exchange as an engine of prosperity. The state and and governments as such, there's a totally different way of viewing the world. And so markets are going to have a hard time, as always, trying to grapple with this intersection between state power and the market itself and the provision of commodities. War is destructive, for instance, and it's unpredictable. The human factors that are present for martial glory and war are very different from the human factors that you're interested in if you're trying to meet the demands of consumers. Just a very different way of thinking. And so I think what you'll see in the market is it's gonna be volatile. It's something that entrepreneurs are going to struggle with. And the key defining feature of the entrepreneur is thinking about the future, speculating about the unknown, and trying to bring knowledge to where there's ignorance. And that's a hard thing to do. It's especially hard in the nature of war. So that's why, when you have theft, again, unpredictable does damage. That will cause economic problems. Unforeseen natural disaster, earthquake rips through San Francisco. You didn't expect that. It's an unforeseen and unforeseeable natural disaster that afflicts you, and it comes out of nowhere, and you can't prepare for it. And then of course inflation and theft, when you have regulatory and financial manipulation, state manipulation of markets, and that can also cause serious problems with trying to think through consumer demand, because you're seeing certain lines of production are favored in favor of others because of their political access. So those are things that can cause the normal trading, entrepreneurial, investor mindset. It isn't the same, and it runs into real problems. And so I think, therefore, trying to read the tea leaves from the market is, and a subject like the Iran war, is really going to be difficult. You have to really dig into the data, and you have to accept there's just a lot of ignorance. There's a lot that you just can't know. We don't see. There's a lot of information that we're missing. We're not part of conversations in the White House. I don't know what's going on in Tehran. I'm not even really sure who's in charge of Iran right now. We don't actually know how many missiles are on target. We don't know if either side is lying about casualty numbers. We don't know. There's a lot of fog of war, and it's going to prevent ordinary people from being able to interpret that data effectively. And it's also going to prevent even advanced investors to also make clear predictions about what will happen. It's very speculative and very volatile, and that's why you see the sort of swings that we're seeing now. Is there's just a lack of knowledge, and inevitably that's going to be the case. Obviously, I want to see the war end as soon as possible, because I don't want to see more economic harm done. I want Trump to be helped. But again, I don't know if that will happen or not. There's reasons to be hopeful. I think Trump has a lot of power to end this. On the other hand, there's reasons to think, well, maybe Iran really does want to play for keeps. They really want to build a deterrent, and crashing the global economy might be a way of getting that deterrent, and really could reshape the global order as such. I mean, really, to put it in another perspective, America is dominant, yes, and we're able to inflict. I'm certain that we have done way more damage to Iran than Iran has done to the American military and its allies. The problem, though, is even the slightest defeat is that could pop the bubble around American invincibility, and that could have long-term consequences. It just takes one missile hitting an aircraft carrier to really remake and reshape the world order. Honestly, if the Iranians are able to shoot down an F-35, that would be a crisis. Right? Like that's where we are. Our weapon systems are so advanced, they're so expensive. The presumption that the sort of starting expectations are so high that if they're thwarted at all, it could create very serious political blowback for those in power. It's just a lot of risk that's being taken on by the Trump administration right now. And that doesn't mean they won't achieve their goals. They might very well succeed. Trump has an almost preternatural ability to survive and succeed, against all expectations, and that could very well happen here. Again, my argument goes back to, I think the ends being pursued are in question, but whether or not Trump can succeed in attaining the ends that he's set for himself that's a much different question, much harder to answer. And so, yeah, again, looking at the war itself, these are, don't panic, don't freak out, but also keep your mind alive, and you want to be paying attention. I set up here some stuff I've learned, and I thought I'll just share with my audience here. I learned just a couple days ago. I've been doing some reading about Iran's experience in the Iran-Iraq War, and what I was kind of surprised by was that I had not known that Iraq had initiated that war. I learned that this week. What I also learned is that the Iraqis used chemical weapons against Iran, and the Iranians did not respond in kind. And I checked a number of different sources here. One, Foreign Policy magazine, and then also another article by um, Javed Ali, who's now I think writes on non-proliferation. Anyway, a good article on chemical weapons in the 1980s. And another one by Gareth Porter and Foreign Policy. So those are two big sources I was looking at here. And what's striking, and trying to double checking these claims, and I think this is right from everything I've seen. It's amazing to me that we have this whole mythology is built up that Iran is super dangerous, they're irrational. If they get a nuclear weapon, they'll immediately use it on Israel because they yell death to America in the streets. And yet, when you look at the facts on the ground, it looks like very clearly that the Iranian regime is very reticent to use weapons of mass destruction and has religious objections at the very highest levels. So, for instance, in the 2014 Foreign Policy magazine story, the Ayatollah Khomeini, his fatwa against nuclear and chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War was meant literally. And even though the Iranians, very late in the war, I think 1986 onward, they began developing a small chemical weapons program as a kind of deterrent, and it apparently was never even truly fully weaponized. Even then, the Ayatollah maintained that he had the complete control over the deployment of those weapons, if they were to exist, and lobbied against them. And apparently, the chemical weapons program started without the Ayatollah even knowing. And this is information we've learned through WikiLeaks, that cables that were released much later. But it's just striking to me. Again, Saddam Hussein, Javed Ali in his article makes the case that there was 50 to 60,000 casualties the Iranians suffered from mustard gas being used against their people, both civilians and military targets. And it was very traumatic for them as a people, I think, and it's influenced, among other things, their view of the world. Very conservative fortress view that seems to predominate in Iranian thinking, very conservative. But yeah, again, it's a very striking thing. You would not know that listening to the sources that you see on X talking about the evils of the Iranian regime, but that when they were confronted with weapons of mass destruction and were attacked with those weapons, they did not respond in kind, even though there was the possibility of doing so, and the reasoning came from the religious orders of the effective head of state for the Iranian regime. That's a surprising thing. You would not know that listening to Fox News. Yeah, this, again, I'm inclined to believe, in fact, just in what I'm seeing, is that the Iranian, it's not obvious that the Ayatollah Khamenei, the successor to Khomeini, it seems pretty clear that the Iranians probably could have developed a nuclear weapon and did not. And it is not obvious to me that the only reason they didn't get a weapon was because of Israel. It seems like there's another strand of religious and conservative argument happening within the Iranian regime that pushed away the prospect of developing nuclear weapons, or kept it at an arm's distance, sort of halfway house. Honestly, probably foolish to do that. They really would have been in a much better position if they just devoted all of their resources to get a nuclear weapon in the 90s. If the North Koreans could do it, the Iranians could do it, and they should have found someone to help them make that happen. Because you're looking now, there'd be a lot more, just my analysis of the regime is they absolutely need to acquire nuclear weapons if they want to be sovereign. If you don't want to be under the Israeli thumb as an Iranian, you need atomic weapons. If you don't want to have the Americans bombing you every couple months, that's where we are now. But again, it seems like there's something very conservative about their regime and its religious impulses that have prevented that outcome from taking place. And there's a good piece, and here, I think I can actually just read this at the risk of boring the audience. Interesting passage that the experience of being afflicted with chemical weapons was enough for the Iranians to come to the conclusion that the development of that you would not, because Iraq had been able to use chemical weapons without consequence, the Iranians came to believe that the international restrictions on weapons of mass destruction were not serious. And so, arguably, the factions within the Iranian regime pursuing nuclear weapons very much shaped by that experience. Oh, it turns out all this talk of non-proliferation and serious people in DC, you're so bad if you do this. Turns out it didn't matter when it was Saddam Hussein. Until it mattered later, but that's another story. And again, this I think had a profound psychological effect on the Iranians. And I'll just read from Javed Ali's article here. Is a passage called "Lessons Learned." Let's see. And here I'll quote, for Iran, what was most disturbing about Iraq's use of chemical weapons was the muted international criticism of Iraq for conducting such flagrant violations of the 1925 Geneva Protocol. In the eyes of many in the Iranian leadership, the international community's failure to condemn or punish Iraq for its chemical weapons attacks against Iran. Iraq was only severely criticized after it unleashed nerve gas attacks against the Kurdish town of Halabja in March of 1988, demonstrated the depth of international indifference, if not outright hostility, toward Iran. Iranian decision makers concluded that the international community's tepid response to Iraq's chemical attacks signaled that the global powers were more likely to reward violations of international law than to recognize the dangerous precedent Iraq had established, at least when Iran was involved in such conflicts. Iraq's chemical weapons attacks reinforced Iran's strategic insecurities and most likely motivated Iran to try to acquire or produce weapons of mass destruction, especially chemical weapons agents. Moreover, given the effectiveness of Iraqi chemical weapons attacks against Iranian forces, especially during the later stages of the campaign, Iranian commanders also began to appreciate the tactical, if not strategic, utility of chemical weapons on the battlefield. So again, pretty damning for the liberal world order. Oh, we have these principles. We condemn the use of these weapon systems. Non-proliferation is so important. Iran was victimized by the use of weapons of mass destruction in a very traumatic way. About 10% of the casualties they suffered were very horrific chemical attacks. I mean, this is mustard gas. This is horrific. And the lesson they learned was the West is not serious. And therefore, if we want to secure ourselves, we should be willing and able to develop weapons of mass destruction. That view, at least, was common among some faction within the Iranian regime. And again, of course, you're in tension with the religious leadership that controls the state itself and wants to present itself as a pure, morally, elevated state in comparison to its secular opponents. So it's interesting that in the Iranian perspective, so much of their national consciousness, as far as I can intuit from my distant viewing, is rooted in a kind of insecurity regarding outside powers manipulating and attacking Iran. Again, another fact I have not seen mentioned anywhere on social media since the war began, excuse me, Iran. So some people, people talk about 47 years of war going back to 1979, the revolution. A lot of lefties and some people like me also know that in 1953, the American government worked to overthrow and succeeded in overthrowing the prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. What's not been mentioned at all is that if you go back even further, in 1941, Iran was invaded by both the British Empire and by the Soviet Union as part of securing supply lines for after Operation Barbarossa and the Nazis entered the Soviet Union. The only way they could be supplied was, well, not the only way, but the primary route of supply to a warm water port was through Iran. And it was really important to have access to those shipments for the Soviet regime. And what's interesting, too, is that in 1943, there was a conference among the Allied leaders at Tehran. And Iran, this sort of puppet government, quasi-puppet government that was set up after the Anglo-Soviet invasion, was really not included in those diplomatic talks at all as a serious power. There's just literally dirt on which Allied leaders from the superpowers are meeting in a kind of contemptuous or dismissive view toward Iran as a sovereign entity. So if you want to look at Iranian history, even within living memory, I mean, from the last 85 years, you're looking at, just constant intervention by the West and by outsiders and by even the Soviets in Iranian life. They're just constantly being messed with by their neighbors. You're invaded in 1941. Your government gets overthrown in 1953 on behalf of British oil interests. And then after that, you have a long-standing authoritarian liberal regime. It doesn't really go together, but authoritarian westernization, which, by the way, had been present in the 1920s and 30s as well. So Reza Shah, who had to give up his position in 1941, leading Iran because of his pro-German sympathies. So what you see then is, but before then you have mandatory westernization, which was deeply controversial in Iran then, in the 1930s. For instance, Reza Shah put in place restrictions on the hijab, mandatory restrictions on the hijab. By 1979, after his son is kicked out of power, the Shah of Iran in 1979, by then you see the force in mandatory hijab. Again, so you see Iran is being tossed between westernizing influences, foreign invasion, and a deeply rooted social conservatism. All of this is mixing together they feel like they're constantly under attack, they're constantly being manipulated, they're trying to preserve their way of life, or some faction is trying to preserve their vision of Islam, and they're doing all of this at a hotspot of, the global energy market. And again, I think that it's easier then to understand how the Iranian regime is thinking. Or I think, more easily put myself in the place of policymakers on the other side of the table. And I think that's a crucial skill. You have to be able and willing to think through, how does my opponent view the world? How do they view the world? How do they think about the circumstances and what we're doing to them? Even when you don't agree, it's just good to be able to put yourself in your opponent's shoes. And that's what I'm trying to do here, just in my own reading. Like many of you listening, I'm not a Middle East expert, geopolitics, oil markets, commodities trading. I have a newsletter. No, I'm consider myself a student and a scholar and a serious American citizen. I want to think like things happen. I want to know about them. I want to use my mind to try and take these lessons that I've learned in my field, really, political science, thinking about justice, and then make an informed analysis. I think we all are called to do that. In any moment of crisis, we have to think through what's confronting us. So anyway, I hope that's helpful, right? So, and like I said I think I'll wrap it up here. As I said in the first episode, the goal of the show is to make you think. And if I've shown you something here today that helps you to think through stuff that's happening and puts you in a better spiritual orientation toward the world, I've succeeded. So again, the main goals of the show today is to explain some important facets of Iranian psychology, to examine the very real possibilities and different alternatives plausibly available to policymakers right now. Trying to show there isn't a reason to panic or to have, don't panic. Don't give into a spirit of fear. Also, you need to know there are dangers, but you should not let them guide your reason. You need to take it one step at a time. And when you're thinking through these problems, use your mind, right? Don't let yourself be guided by emotion and crash out, and just look at it as a problem, as something that you as an informed citizen can think about in a serious way. So again, that's what I've got for today. And hopefully, and my goal is each time I do this, the show will improve. Hopefully it'll get funnier. Like, this is very earnest. But we can work on that. So again, you can follow me in my social media. I'm on X at @JLippincott_. You can also follow me at Regime Critic. This has been episode 2 of Lippincott Talk. I am your host, Josiah Lippincott, and I can't wait to see you here again next time.